Gonna wait and see how the stream quality is. Sometimes it's not so great. No one's online yet. Just talking to myself. That's good. I can practice. And maybe someday somebody else can watch this. So I'm going to start off with some good news today. So first of all, day 2 of JVB Live here in Hawaii. JVB in Hawaii. I'm Joel Van Brunt, and I've lived in Hawaii for the last 7 years. Like many, stuck in the house, 4 young kids who are all sleeping right now. That's when I got to do this, sneak out at nap time. Unemployed presently. That happened last week. And just pivoting, like many of us, trying to figure out what else I can do with my time. Work on a skill. I'm going to work on these periscopes, hopefully daily, maybe less often, maybe more often. I don't know. We'll see how this goes. But I want to start off today with some good news. So the good news is I just saw a tweet that Indiana Jones 5 is approved. So we are going to see Indiana Jones 5 in 2022. Now, how many of us will still be around then? I don't know, but I love Indiana Jones. It was one of the things I grew up with as a kid. I played trumpet, and I used to play that theme song in school, the Indiana Jones theme song. So I'm pretty stoked on that. Also, I just want to start off on a positive note too, that people are awesome. You know, there's all these memes going around and threads. I saw a tweet with this looked like a teenage boy who stacked 15 rolls of toilet paper in a doorway, and then was trying to figure out how to jump over them and not hit the top of the door as he was rolling down. So that's been fun to see how people are dealing with this quarantine issue. It's also weird, you know, I haven't been able to go to a barbershop. So relaxed grooming standards for many of us who are used to getting more regular haircuts. It's an interesting time, and I'm sure that the way going back to the way of life we had before is going to be different in the future. So now I wanted to talk about a few things that happened over the last 24 hours. So first, I watch the presidential press conferences every night. I don't watch them live. It's too slow for me. So what I do is I wait, and also I'm in Hawaii, so they come out pretty early for Hawaiian time. But I wait until they come out on YouTube, and then I play them at 2 times speed. So I'm able to get the content in half the time, which for me is great with young kids. So I watched that. And what's interesting is it was the first time I heard Jared Kushner kind of speak in one of these press conferences. I think it was the first time he did speak in one of these press conferences. And I got to say that I was impressed. Now, in my background, I've been in many positions of leadership, both on the military side and the corporate side. And one thing you look for in a leader, and if there's anything the military is, it's a test bed for leadership, good leaders and bad leaders. And so you learn a lot about what good leadership looks like and what bad leadership looks like. And I was impressed by these press conferences in general because it does signal strong leadership. And what Jared Kushner said last night was interesting because it jumped out at me. He said that basically the states asking the federal government for things they think they need based on emotion and based on fear. And the question put back to the states is, well, how many do you have in your state? For example, let's say face masks or ventilators. Hey, how many ventilators do you have in your state? And do you know where they are? Can you access them? Can you repurpose them from a warehouse down south to up north? And the governors, some of them, don't have good answers. They don't have a good accountability of where stuff is in their state. And there's some structural issues with that, I can imagine. So you have private-public partnerships with public hospitals, with private hospitals. They have their different supply chains. What I'm learning is the supply chain for public hospitals might be a little bit more difficult to shore up versus private hospitals. The private hospitals would have more money, presumably. So But he made a comment that I'm going to paraphrase it, but he basically said that this crisis is allowing voters to determine whether the politicians they've elected into governorships or mayorships are good managers or simply good politicians. And the implication was is that some of them just aren't doing this very well. They they are uh, basically reacting emotionally, like much of the public is, and not thinking through how best to utilize the limited resources that we have. And I thought that was a very striking comment in the press conference. And then when I jump on Twitter, which I do a couple times a day, uh, there's a lot of hate of Jared Kushner, which was surprising to me. I first of all, let me tell you about myself. I have not had cable television since 2006. What is that? 14 years. Not that I don't watch cable television on occasion. I do tap in to kind of get the sense of what the mood is on cable television, but I don't practice on a regular basis watching the daily news cycle on cable television. I will watch it and I'll read it on Twitter and I'll read articles and that kind of thing. And if it's important enough, I'll jump on YouTube, and usually the important clips on cable television are archived, and you can access it via YouTube after the fact. But so the reason I say that is because when I come to these press conferences, I think I come with an unjaded perspective from seeing a whole 14 years worth of cable news. That's my impression. And so when I saw Jared Kushner get up there and make his presentation, it was good. And all the performers, the Admiral, Secretary Mnuchin, all these people last night signaled strong leadership. They had a good grasp on the supply chain. They had a good grasp on the way the money's going to flow, and I'll talk about that in a second. The money flow for these business loans that's happening today, Friday. All right, trying to start this up again after getting booted off. My internet is still not doing very well. So I don't get the hate for Jared Kushner. I don't. He doesn't look like he puts anybody off. People think that maybe it's nepotism with the Trump family, but I don't understand it. And people that I respect, like Michelle Malkin on Twitter, um, I've met Jared Kushner, and nice guy, reasonable guy. So I don't think that people who critique him have very well informed critiques, at least what I've seen on Twitter in the last 24 hours. So that's that's number one. Another thing, that came out of the press conference last night was that there's a difference between different states in their trajectory of the COVID cases. So New York being one of them, as compared to say California, 20 million versus 40 million, and how California's curve has kind of flattened and New York has kind of gone exponential up. And so uh, I was thinking about this, and I was like, okay, what are the reasons for why California would be different than New York State in terms of the number of cases? COVID entered California presumably earlier. It was up in San Francisco, uh, but I've lived in LA, I've lived in San Francisco, and not San Francisco, San Diego, and I know that the way of life in California is very different than New York. I grew up in New York, so New York State, much more compressed. New York City, obviously people living on top of each other, public transportation. California, LA is like the biggest sprawled city in the U.S. It goes on forever, and I lived there for a year and a half, so I'm familiar with the way of life. No one takes the trains. I mean, there are trains, but they're not to the extent that the metro system is in, say, like a Washington D.C. or New York State or New York City. So as I was thinking about why the difference would be, it'd be much easier to stay isolated and not interact with people in close proximity in California. And that's one thing I thought of. And also, California is hotter. It's warm. It's starting to get in the late spring or mid spring temperatures. I work in California every month or so, and so I'm familiar with the weather patterns. And I grew up in New York State, so I know what the weather's like in New York State. So I'm thinking, okay, well, the way of life, the sprawl, the spread outness is probably a factor in California versus New York. And then I see a tweet from one of the guys I follow on Twitter, uh, uh, basically critiquing Rush Limbaugh on something he said about the difference between New York and California. Oh, okay. And the critique was we don't need a college dropout trying to offer ignorant and misinformed information on California versus New York. So I go in and I look at the critique, and then I look at the source of the critique, which is a Daily Wire news source, and I follow Daily Wire. I think Ben Shapiro's a smart guy. Um, People hate him, but they don't understand him, I don't think. So there's an article, and the article just talks about what Rush is hypothesizing on his show about the reasons for the difference. And uh, one claim is the social distancing um, is the reason. And so Rush just offered a couple other explanations: the sprawl, the public transportation, the temperature. These are the exact things that I thought of uh, on my own, having lived in both states. And yet, Rush is getting critiqued because he's a college dropout. That's just stupid. That's a dumb critique. Um, but alas, we have to find something to pick on with everybody in public who disagrees with us, or we find reason to fight their narrative. It's very sad that that's the case. Now I got to take this phone call. I'll be back. Okay, feed is started. My AirPods are getting low on battery. My stream quality update, the quality's been automatically lowered because of the website, or the internet connections. That's good. So I was talking about this really poor argument against the point of view because you attack the person's academic background or whatnot, being a college dropout. I just, I mean, there's a time and place. There's a legitimate distinction, and what I'm talking about specifically is a tweet that took issue with Rush Limbaugh's discussion over why California would have a different infection rate than New York City. And before I got cut off, I was offering a couple reasons that I had thought about, having lived in both states: lower use of public transportation in California, more spread out population, sprawl in Los Angeles, much less dense, and the temperature. It's a different climate. So those three factors, to me, having lived in both places, might partially explain the difference between California and New York. The social distancing, which came out of last night's discussion with the president's task force and the press conference, I think that was presented as possibly the main reason for the difference. And I think just Rush was saying that that's maybe not the case. And so people attacked Rush for being a college dropout and offering a perspective on this, and being ignorant and misinformed, which I don't know if that critique is necessarily warranted. Okay, moving on. So here in Hawaii, the first case of COVID-19 is now reported in Molokai, which is interesting because Molokai has a very low population compared to Maui or the Big Island where I am, or Oahu. So there we go. First one in Molokai. There's also an interesting graph that is going around Twitter, where you see the unemployment figures from, I don't know, 1960. I can't remember where the graph started, but it has a trickle, and all of a sudden we get to 2020 and it exponentially goes up just way more than any time in the past. So yeah, I mean, we shut down the world economy. That's what we did. So not a surprise, but it just really is an interesting framing for where we currently are. Finally, the money for the small business stuff came out today. SBA.gov guidelines went into effect. That came out of the press conference tomorrow. So this might impact me, or people in my family. There may be an opportunity for our employers to call us back and put us back on payroll. But as you would expect, there's going to be a overloading of the banks to process those applications and to figure out who needs it, who doesn't. It's just going to be a mess for a while. And I like Marco Rubio's tweet: some perspective, and this is a quote, some perspective on a mass and unprecedented emergency program that passed a week ago today.
Original SBA Gov guidelines to lenders Wednesday did not reflect legislative intent to make the process simple. The guidelines were updated and released last night. So, rocky start. Bankers are trying to figure it out, and it's just going to take a week or so to get through this. Sad news. I learned from Breitbart that Bill Withers died. He was the artist who sang "Lean on Me," and what's ironic is that last night I was singing, or yesterday, sometime during the day, I was singing "Lean on Me" to my kids. So he did not die from coronavirus, but he was 81, died of heart complications, I guess. But yeah, it's just ironic that I was singing that just yesterday. So National Review put out an article that goes over the 41 worst people you meet on Twitter. So 41 categories, which is kind of a laundry list of categories, but it was kind of funny to read the list and figure out where you are in there. And it had everything. It had the PhD, academic expert that were PhDs in their profile title. It had the old retired class that have been civil servants or maybe politicians that are now retired that just kind of snipe in from the top rope. But it was pretty clever. And then there's another critique that CNN seems to be harping on of the administration, which is that, people knew in the administration they were sounding the alarm for this coronavirus pandemic worry last year. Criticism of Trump's, shifting funding resources in certain departments. So, the critique is that people knew that this was coming. People knew this was coming. And if you remember back to 9/11, this was the whole 9/11 commission that we should have known this was coming. Warnings were ignored, et cetera, et cetera. And so I have a problem with this critique in a lot of ways because there's a lot of fog of war and everything's a trade-off when you get into management or executive leadership. Everything's a trade-off. You have to pick and choose what you prioritize. And it's a guessing game. You do the best with the information you have. You have no idea the risk associated with one of these black swan events. And that's why they're black swans. That's why Nicholas Nassim Taleb wrote the book, The Black Swan, which is a great book. You should read it. But so CNN had this tweet. Two top administration officials last year listed the threat of a pandemic as an issue that greatly worried them, undercutting President Trump's repeated claims that the coronavirus pandemic was an unforeseen problem. And I forwarded this and I said, okay, geniuses, what's our next war? Who and how and when? Go. So this is my attempt to frame this that hindsight gives you a level of confidence that is unwarranted. We really don't know the future. We can make educated guesses, we can try to predict, but we really don't know what the future holds. So that critique kind of, in my view, isn't that strong. Also, Brit Hume, I like him over at Fox. He forwards this thread of media downplaying the idea that the spread of the virus happened from a Chinese lab. And now this was put out weeks ago and poo-pooed by many in the media. And now these same media outlets are running that this might be an actual real possibility. And so what's remarkable is that people have these emotional reactions to events, and the emotional reaction usually comports to whatever their prior narrative is. Now, if you give it some time, that time could be 24 hours, that time could be 3-4 weeks, you will return to that topic without the same emotion that you may have had, and therefore be able to look at the evidence with a clear head. And I think that's what's happening with this Chinese lab, that this was evidence put forward weeks ago, was poo-pooed as ignorant, as conspiracy theory and whatnot. Senator Tom Cotton, I think, was big on this. And now it turns out that there's some credibility to this theory by the same people who had this initial emotional reaction. So let's see, what else do I want to talk about? Okay, so Lawrence Tribe tweeted that the Boston Globe today, I used to live in Boston too, the editorial board wrote, quote, "The president has blood on his hands," end quote. That's the terrible truth, but almost as awful as how many Americans are in denial about that reality and are complicit in his rewriting of history. So, pretty harsh tweet. So, I said, okay, if the president has blood on his hands, I submit the following additions: governors, mayors, the Democratic impeachment effort back in January, which, by the way, if you don't remember, because we have short term memories, the actual vote to acquit the president happened on February 6th, 7th, right after the State of the Union. That's not that long ago. What was happening in January? Coronavirus outbreak in China and impeachment. And then if you look at the Democratic candidates and their debates and what they said on this, this threat was downplayed by the Speaker of the House as recently as February 25th or 24th, 25th, when she was holding a press conference that people should be visiting Chinatown, that nothing was wrong. So this revisionist history, I think, is not to be entirely laid at the president's feet. Also, Lawrence Tribe is, you probably heard that Adam Schiff is drafting articles to open an investigation on the coronavirus COVID-19 outbreak. And here we go again, right? The president mentioned this in his press conference last night. So, Lawrence Tribe, at a minimum, every American deserves to know there is absolutely no constitutional obstacle to a second impeachment vote. The obstacle is purely political. And then you can imagine what the comments that ensued for that thread. So I replied and forwarded this: hey, it is a wonderful idea to remove a sitting president during a crisis and right before an election. No, it's not. So that's my 2 cents. That's what I believe. You don't seek to, and frankly, I can't read minds, but I think that the reason some people at the CDC and DHS might still be employed in their current roles is because it's not the right time to remove an expert when we're dealing with a national emergency of this sort. So, also, you may have seen Jim Clyburn, Democrat, called the coronavirus relief bill a tremendous opportunity to restructure things to fit our vision. Never let a crisis go to waste, right? I think Rahm Emanuel said that. All right, so I think that's all I have for right now. Thanks for tuning in. No one's made any comments, but it's a good opportunity to practice. Hey, we're all pivoting to try to figure out what else we can do. I could dig ditches, or I could jump on Periscope and practice. And maybe some of you out there, if you ever see this, like what you see. If you do, leave a comment, and I will talk to you later.